All right, so we're dealing in this little last bit of lecture here with the consequences of the Bay of Pigs invasion, among which will be the intensification of tensions between the United States and Soviet Union. And the flashpoint of this in the summer of 1961 is the Berlin Wall crisis. Okay, so right after the Bay of Pigs invasion fails, right? Khrushchev and Castro are up there condemning it, saying obviously America was involved in planning this, and it's a little bit embarrassing for the United States, not just that they failed, that they were involved in this kind of covert thing or whatever on a global, publicity type of thing. And, Khrushchev, the other thing is Khrushchev and Kennedy are getting ready to meet each other for the first time in June of 1961. And Khrushchev is now looking at Kennedy as this blundering young guy who doesn't know what he's doing, and Kennedy's a little bit worried about his reputation. He wants Khrushchev to think he's a really tough guy, right? But they're getting ready to meet in June at this big conference, diplomatic conference in Vienna, okay, that had been planned for a little while, but the whole thing is going to be overshadowed by the Bay of Pigs failure. Okay, so there's also a lot of negative reaction in the United States, and primarily Kennedy gets blamed for removing air support from the invasion force and for refusing to send in a second airstrike to support the land invasion. Okay, and this was very, very much criticized by a lot of people. All right, that definitely didn't help at all. There's other things though that were problematic about the whole plan from the very beginning. One was the site of the Bay of Pigs clearly was a bad one. They didn't put a lot of thought into that with the swamp and everything and the coral reef that they didn't even know about. Okay, so the site was already bad, right? The other thing was most of really all of the military, whatever they are, advisors had underestimated Castro's resources, military resources. So he's got 25,000 men in his army. He can call up 250,000 reserve forces in militias if he wants to. And what else? Oh, he's got Soviet tanks, right? So look, he's got a lot, right? Okay. And so some historians would say, look, if this whole thing was actually going to be successful, then what would have had to happen is you would have had to have 10,000 troops involved in the invasion, and you would have had to have full American commitment to the invasion. And that would, of course, include not removing the air support when it was needed most, right? Okay, so all of that. And the whole thing was poorly conceived. But it doesn't really, and it does make, Kennedy maybe a little more reflective than he had been initially, okay? But he remains more committed to these CIA covert operation type things. That continues. In fact, there's this thing called Operation Mongoose, which is this ongoing attempt to kind of get rid of Castro throughout the rest of Kennedy's presidency. Yeah, and none of that ever works out, of course. Okay, so that's ongoing, right? But the other sort of the center of the reaction, or the most, maybe frightening moment that is a consequence of the Bay of Pigs initially is the Berlin Wall crisis. So Kennedy goes to meet Khrushchev in Vienna as planned. Khrushchev is doing what he did with Eisenhower a couple of years before, which he is demanding, or he's threatening to cut off Eastern Berlin from Western Berlin, because you have all these refugees that are taking advantage of the fact that Berlin is still divided between an American zone and a Soviet zone. And so people are, of course, coming into Berlin from other parts of East Germany and fleeing into the American zone and using it to get away from communism. And there's this flood of refugees within Berlin, and Khrushchev wants to shut it down, right? And so he's threatening to negotiate a separate treaty with East Germany that would shut down the refugee thing more definitively, right? And potentially maybe even cut off the United States from access to West Berlin, if we think back to that Berlin airlift crisis as well. That was another optional one, which maybe some of you might have looked at, who knows? But so basically Kennedy is dealing with the same thing that Eisenhower was a couple of years before with the Berlin situation. And Kennedy, like Eisenhower, does not back down. He demands more defense spending. He is ready to mobilize a bunch of reservists if necessary. And he starts calling for the creation of a program for fallout shelters from the potential radiation, right, of nuclear war. Okay, so he's getting ready for the possibility of war, and he's trying to show Khrushchev that he's ready to go to war, and he's not going to back down in Berlin. He's not going to abandon Western Berlin. And Khrushchev does the same thing. He asks for more money for defense spending. And then he does something which is kind of the heart of the crisis here. He builds the Berlin Wall. He starts just erecting this wall overnight. And it starts out with barbed wire, but then literally brick by brick, this wall is being constructed. And people are, all of a sudden, people who could move between one part of the city and the other. Maybe they had family and say they were residents in the Soviet section and had family in the American section. Well, now they're suddenly cut off from each other and they can't see each other anymore, right? And so heavily guarded, and now there's an actual physical barrier to represent the division within the city, okay? And of course, it's tragic for the inhabitants of the city, especially for those in the Soviet zone. All right, and this of course cuts off the refugees moving from the Soviet zone of the city into the American zone of the city. It cuts down on the refugees from East Germany into West Germany a lot, right? But Kennedy also recognizes that the Soviets have a right to cut off their own part of the city. They're in occupation of it, right? And he doesn't challenge that. So he behaves with a little more kind of level-headed way here. But it is one of the most tense moments in the Cold War because you have American tanks facing off versus Soviet tanks within the city of Berlin. You have both of these nations poised for nuclear war. You have both leaders kind of looking at this as a test of each other's manhood. Who's going to back down? Who's going to stand his ground? And thankfully, nobody launches a nuclear war and war is averted, okay? Kennedy does send 1,500 troops into the city, into the American zone, to show that he supports that part of the city. He's not going to abandon it. And Khrushchev kind of backs down from negotiating a separate treaty with East Germany, and the Berlin Wall then simply remains, cutting the two parts of the city off from each other, okay? But war is averted, at least, in that very tense summer of 1961, okay? Itself kind of emblematic of this rising tension between the Soviet Union and America under Kennedy.